Bismillah, salatu wassalamu ala rasulillah, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Welcome to the Burhan Institute of Research. The purpose of that institute is to study the interplay between science and religion. And the purpose of that Islamic evolution series is to map out the current scholarly position on the topic, to showcase the different views and arguments, supporting arguments, and make it available to the community. The broader objective, I guess, is to educate the community and help them gain confidence. So I'll be the host. I have a co-host, Dr. Kamal, Associate Professor at the Gulf University for Science and Technology, so Professor in Applied Mathematics and Quantitative Biology. And today we have the privilege to have you, Professor Rana Dajani. So you're Professor of Molecular Cell Biology at the Hashemite University in Jordan. You recognize as one of the 100 most influential Arab women. You hold a dual expertise in genetic research and community engagement. So on the research side, your work focuses on genetics and epigenetics, more precisely. On the social side, you're the founder of the nonprofit Wheel of Reading, which is a community-led program to increase literacy. You're president of the Society for the Advancement of Science and Technology in the Arab world. You're recipient of quite a few awards, including the WISE Award, and bridging both science and the social realm. You helped establish one of the first ethical laws in Jordan for stem cell research and therapy. So you have quite a large CV. I'll stop here.
Oh, I have a lot of fun.
No, thank you for your work, Subhanallah. We need it. So the way we'll go about, it's like if you can maybe present the main argument, you make a position on the topic on Islam and evolution in maybe 20 minutes. And then we can go through questions. If that makes
Okay.
sense.
Yeah, of course. First of all, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. And thank you
Alaikum.
for inviting me to be
Salam.
on this podcast. And maybe I want to start by sharing that to me, dialogue is very important. Exchange of ideas is very important. Diverse opinions is very important. And to me, that is the core of Islam. In Islam, it celebrates diversity and celebrates having differing opinions. And in the Quran, in more than one verse, it says that is why and how we survive and how a community can survive, not just survive, but thrive and flourish. I'm very excited and look forward to listening to differing opinions. To me, I enjoy to listen, and I'm always open to trying to understand the other's opinion sincerely, really sincerely. And I think this is also something that I draw from Islam, that we have to be humble and we have to respect that others can and may come with an opinion that is very different than our own. And we need to respect that and understand where it comes from, even if we may disagree. So respecting and listening doesn't necessarily mean agreeing, but I think it's very, very important. And I think being open to multiple opinions is part of being comfortable with ambiguity, which is a trait we have as humans, but it's on a spectrum. Some are very comfortable with ambiguity and some are not. They need closure. And I think I lie on the way farther end of being comfortable with ambiguity and willing and really curious to understand other people's opinions. So with that, I just wanted that's why I'm so thankful to be here and so excited as well, and consider it an opportunity to learn. So I love the challenging questions. My position on evolution and Islam stems, of course, from a lifetime of experience and discussions and listening to others. Of course, being a scientist and going through the science and understanding the science and being a researcher, active researcher in genetics and epigenetics. And it also comes from being a Muslim, a practicing Muslim, but also a Muslim who has a certain measure of knowledge of Islam, right? Not a shallow knowledge, but a certain depth of Islam. Again, with humility, and I don't claim to be an Islamic scholar, but enough to engage and share my opinion. And maybe lastly, I like to give a disclaimer that this is my opinion as Rana Dajani, and I do not impose it on anybody at all. And I think that's also part of being Muslim, that we have differing opinions, but we should never judge others if they have an opinion that is different from us. Only Allah judges, and we are only judged, Allah judges us by our intention, which nobody knows except Allah. So with that, I'll start. So to me, nature around us, we observe it. We observe all these phenomena around us of living creatures, because that's the part of nature that we're talking about. And throughout history, there have been many scientists who have, and I use the word scientist meaning to define it as a person who observes nature and tries to make sense of it using logic, that there have been scientists throughout history trying to understand nature, regardless of their beliefs, set of beliefs or their faiths. This is part of being human, being curious, asking questions. That's part of why we survive as a species. So that's an innate quality, regardless of our faith. And throughout history, there have been many scientists from the Muslim faith and non-Muslim faith who have been inspired to try to understand and explain why we have such diverse creatures around us. And without going through a history lesson of the different hypotheses that were put forward across centuries, and because anybody builds on the hypotheses of others, nobody comes with knowledge totally out of the blue. So in the past, there were scientists from the Islamic faith who spoke of trying to explain the, let's say, the diversity of species, diversity of organisms around us. But I think what Darwin came, when he came in the 19th century, he came with a very elegant explanation of the process by which he proposed the different creatures came to existence in nature around us. And I'm sure he built on previous scientists. And of course, scientists built upon his hypotheses, let's say, at that time, which today we can claim, to the extent of human knowledge, we can claim it's a theory. And of course, it's very important to distinguish between a hypothesis and a theory. There's always a little bit of ambiguity around that. Basically, the theory of evolution states that there is, for any population of organisms, there's diversity in that population. And when we talk about diversity, there's diversity in the genetic makeup of the members of that population, meaning they are not all identical genetically. So that's number one. Number two, as a population living in an environment, the environment is always changing. Whether it's physical factors, biological factors, it is changing. And therefore, these members of the community or of the population are exposed to these different changing circumstances of the environment around them. Now, because they are very different, these members will respond differently to these environmental circumstances. Some will perish because of those environmental circumstances, and some will survive. And those who survive enough to reproduce and have offspring will contribute to the future generation, to the future members of the population. And therefore, as the environment changes over time, the traits of the population will change over time based on which member was able to survive within those circumstances. Therefore, there is no better or worse. There's always constant change. And the fodder for that change, for the survival of the population, is the diversity in the genetic makeup. That diversity, we may not understand why it is there until it hits the right appropriate environmental stimulus or circumstance that will therefore be an advantage to a particular member to survive. That is natural selection and a very simple version of what is evolution. Nobody can predict the environmental changes, and nobody can predict the diversity of the population. It is the interaction of both that creates this process through which different organisms will evolve and change traits. If we give them enough time and diversity of environmental circumstances, eventually, after a long time, the traits of a particular group of organisms will be very different from that of their ancestors. And if there is a separation in the population to two different groups exposed to two different environmental circumstances over a long time, also the descendants of that original population will be very different from each other as well as from their ancestor. So that's basically how the different organisms have come to exist in our world. Some, of course, become extinct and some remain until today. And these organisms are still evolving. So that's, for me, I explained in simple terms the theory of evolution. Now, when we come to Islam, the way I look at Islam, to me, I believe that there is a creator, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And I believe that he has all his 99 sifat, in English, and his attributes, and that he, just for the lack of a better word, Allah, is above all dimensions within the universe that we live in or can sense. Because I believe there is something beyond the universe that we sense, because we are limited by our biology to sense 4 dimensions at this point. I mean, we can calculate more dimensions theoretically, but we cannot sense them. So Allah, to me, is beyond dimensions, and specifically beyond the dimension of time. and he is different from us, so there's nothing we can imagine him to be, and therefore we should never think of him or describe him within the terms of our limited biology. So to me, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the creator of everything, started this universe, the one we live in, the one we are aware of. He started it at some point in time in the past. And when he started it, he put down the rules, the physical, natural laws that govern this universe that he created. And as those laws, the universe unfolded according to those laws. So whether we're talking about the physical laws of gravity, relativity, I'm not a physicist, but those are the basics that every scientist should know, at least at minimum. And we see how the universe unfolded, the stars were created, came to be. I use the word create loosely, not meaning Allah, but I mean the formation of the stars based on the laws that Allah put, and then the cooling of the stars, and then the planets, etc. And then finally we have Earth forming and cooling down, and then life coming to being within Earth, because we're talking about Earth. I mean, there may be other universes and other planets, but that's not the point of this discussion. And then life also came to be according to the laws of biology, or laws of life, whatever the right word is saying, which is natural selection, right? That we just described. That's a law. To me, that's a mechanism. That's a process. That's a law that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala put forward, just like the law of gravity. Now, the beginning of life, or the universe itself, that is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala started that. But then it's the laws that he put that everything followed and applied. So for me, evolution does not discuss the origin of life. That is not what evolution talks about. That's a question everybody's still asking. Nobody has an answer. Even in Islam, إن سألتم عن الروح فالروح من أمر ربي. But it's there so we can keep on exploring and asking questions to pique our curiosity. Allah doesn't give us everything. Otherwise, what's the point of surviving and existing if everything is answered? So evolution is about explaining the processes after life happened, how it unfolded. That's what evolution is about. And so that's why I don't see any contradiction between Islam or the Quran and evolution as a process to explain the natural phenomena. Because first of all, the misconception is people think that if you agree that evolution is the mechanism by which nature evolved, or natural things evolved, that you're denying the existence of Allah, which is not the point. We said Allah started everything, and then everything unfolded after that. Now, and maybe a point here is that for me, therefore, if we want to look at the Quran, because that's the book that we refer to in our interpretations of everything around us, or as a guide, to me, the Quran is a guide sent by Allah to Muhammad ﷺ, and previous guides in previous books to other messengers, but the ultimate was the message of Islam, was a book set forth to give us guidelines on how to interact with each other as humans. What is our responsibility? How to take care of the earth, the universe, how to be responsible so that we live good, healthy, therefore happy lives within the time we are on earth. So the Quran in itself is not a book of science. And when I say a book of science, meaning explaining the natural phenomena. In the Quran, there are verses that point to the natural phenomena to pique our curiosity, to stimulate us, to inspire us, to look around, to use our senses, again, back to the role of humans on earth. But it does not give us the answers. And to me, of course, it's not going to give us the answers, because if all the answers are in the book, then there's no point in asking, there's no point in exploring, there's no point in experimenting, and there's no point in survival for that matter. But what the Quran does as part of its role, the way I understand it, it actually invites us and encourages us to ask questions. All the verses that talk about asking and the people who ask, using our brains, using our minds. And to me, it's even like an obligation to use our minds, an obligation to ask questions, an obligation to reflect upon the natural phenomena around us. So this is a calling to ask questions, which is the hallmark of being a scientist. And to me, the ultimate proof, and that's the beauty of the Quran, when you read it again, and every time you read it, you see something new in it. And that's why the Quran is for every time and place, is when Surah Al-Baqarah, when Ibrahim alayhi salam asks Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to, I'm paraphrasing of course, show me how you bring the dead back to life. This is Ibrahim, the Abu al-Anbiya, not me, right? And who is he asking? He's asking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He's not asking another person. He's asking Allah. right? And you think, wait a minute. I mean, should he be allowed? Isn't that a red tape? Sometimes you hear people saying, you can't ask that question. You can't ask it from that person or that thing. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave us the story saying how Ibrahim asked Allah about khalq, about creation, about how that happens. First of all, Allah didn't say you can't ask the question. He didn't say there's a red tape, there's certain questions you can't ask. He just asked him why he was asking the question. Oh, Allah. I mean, that's so wonderful. He's just asking why he asked. He's not saying you shouldn't ask. And then he proceeds to not to answer the question in an abstract way. He actually tells him to go and get a bird, cut it up, etc. So that's scientific method right there. So, if you want to ask a question, you have to do an experiment to test it, to understand it, and so on. So to me, those verses are part of the showcasing how the Quran is a guide. It sets guidelines on how to use the Quran. What is our role when we observe phenomena and what to do about it? And I think it is this understanding of the role of the Quran in our lives, not being a scientific book, but a book of guidance on how our human relationships and our relationships with the physical world, is what made the Islamic civilization make all its discoveries within the Golden Age, because they understood that very well. And scientists, therefore, had license to ask and to observe. And they also knew the necessity of doing an experiment and not just talking, speaking, or in an abstract way, but actually doing the experiments. And hence the scientific method, which is spelt out to me in the Ibrahim asking Allah and Allah responding, it was actually, let's say, put into use by Ibn al-Haytham 1,000 years ago, way before the Enlightenment, that claims that they came up with the scientific method of how you try to explain phenomena. So to me, therefore, any verse in the Quran is there to help guide us, inspire us, but not to give us the final question. Now, the last part of what I want to say is that, therefore, as scientists, when we encounter a physical phenomena or natural phenomena, and using our minds, as Allah told us, using the scientific method, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala told us, we discover a law, a process, okay? And it makes sense within the limitations that we have. And we must remember, we are limited by our biology. We will not know everything. We can't comprehend 11 dimensions. So within the biology that limits us, and within the technical expertise and advancement we have, right? Because maybe in 100 years, there'll be another advancement, and what we today think is the best explanation will not be the best explanation in 100 years. So while acknowledging those limitations, we say that this is the best explanation for a particular phenomena. And in this case, evolution is the best explanation for the diversity of organisms we see around us. Then we say, okay, and using that, we can explain it. Now, if somebody comes from the Quran, from the interpreting the Quran, and says, wait a minute, that seems to contradict a verse in the Quran. So here, the second step is we go and check, okay, what is that apparent contradiction? And usually the contradiction is with the interpretation of the verse and not the actual verse, because the verse, we all believe it is from Allah, right? Nobody, at least I'm not doubting that. That's the verses of the Quran from Allah. The issue is who interprets those verses. Who interprets them are humans. And therefore humans will interpret, and those who have done it in the past or are doing it today, use their conscience, their piety to make their best judgment of what was the interpretation of those verses. And we know in Islam, the beautiful thing is that any mujtahid or interpreter gets 2 rewards if he is right, and 1 reward if he is wrong. So it's a license to interpret and try and explore as much as you can. And in the end, who judges? It's Allah will judge you for your intention, and nobody can say what is your intention except Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So that those 2 things free the mind and the scientist, the Muslim, to explore the world. And therefore, if the interpretation appears to contradict, in this case, evolution, for example, as a theory tested through science, not just talks and abstraction, one goes and revisits the interpretation, because the interpretation was done by humans, and humans err. That's part of who we are. And Allah reminds us that humans will err. So we respect those who came before us. And if we disagree with them, that doesn't mean we are saying they are not good people. We are saying science has advanced. We have new techniques. We have new ideas. Like I said, the Quran is not a book of science with all the laws. And now we have a new way of interpreting those verses that fits the scientific phenomena, which we actually discovered the scientific law using the guidelines from the Quran, right? Which is asking questions, doing the scientific method. So in this circular way, we keep advancing science without contradicting the Quran. And the last thing I want to say here is that we should not be looking for the laws of science in the Quran. Back to the point that the Quran is not a book of science. If we want to discover phenomena and processes describing or explaining phenomena of science, we use the guidelines of the Quran on how to do it. We don't go to the Quran and say, oh, there's the law, and then impose it to explain the natural phenomena without actually doing the scientific research, because then we're not doing what the Quran asks us to do. And in a way, if you use the Quran to explain natural phenomena, you will be hitting yourself, so to speak, because in 100 years, there'll be a new interpretation. And if I every time go back to the Quran and say, oh, look, I found proof of this scientific theory in the Quran, and then the theory changes, and then, oops, the Quran was wrong. No, that was not the original role of the Quran to start with. And I think it's very important to make that distinction. And that way it frees the scientists to keep exploring, and it leaves the Quran pristine, giving us the guidelines on what to do. Now, add to that is what the Quran does. It's a guideline how to live our lives as humans with each other and the universe. It helps guide how we use the science to benefit humanity, right? The science will be discovered regardless of your faith, regardless if you're a good or a bad person. That's human. It's innate, fitra, which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave us. We will keep asking questions and making discoveries. The Quran and Islam guide us how to use those discoveries for good and not for bad, whether we're talking about the atomic bomb, atomic energy, AI, anything, medicine, right? Cloning. It is the guidelines on how to use that science, and not saying the Quran has the scientific answers. Yes. So to me, that's how I approach anybody asking me, can you see proof of the theory of evolution in the Quran? And what about this verse that seems to contradict the theory of evolution? I say the question is wrong, because the Quran that's not the purpose of the Quran. And with that, I will stop and wait for your comments, critiques, and questions.
Jazakallah khairan. That makes it clear. So maybe if you're not looking for proofs of evolution in the Quran, what would be for you the most striking argument for evolution within the sciences? Like, what's the scientific argument for?
Of course, the most prominent explanation or proof is molecular biology, DNA. All living creatures living today or have lived in the past, their blueprint is the genetic material, DNA. And DNA is made of 4 nucleotides, which we share from bacteria to humans and everything in between. And so to me, and then of course, when you compare the sequences of how those nucleotides are arranged between different organisms, you can start to put together the tree, the phylogenetic tree of how much different they are. And therefore you can trace backwards looking at rates of mutation as one thing, but there are many, many, of course, sources of diversity. But then you can trace back when all these organisms or the DNA that you see today was present in an ancestor. And then you can start comparing, right, between different tips of the tree today, whether you're comparing humans with chimpanzees or humans with frogs or with mice, or, trying to figure out, the difference between sharks, how close they are to us, or looking at African elephants versus Indian elephants. I mean, this becomes the tool, the DNA sequence, through which you can actually show how evolution process actually works.
So if I may just continue on that, I remember one of the previous speakers was arguing to not see similarity as a lineage, evidence for lineage, but just see evidence for the same creator. What would you say to people who refuse to see these similarities in the DNA between different species as a proof for lineage, common lineage?
So the answer to me is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the all-powerful, all-great. And it is much more elegant to have a simple answer to explain everything than to have a complicated answer to explain the phenomena we see around us. So if I were to explain what is the explanation of having diverse species, right? That they are all originated from an origin, and that with time and different environmental circumstances, which is natural selection, and of course having the sources of diversity through multiple ways, right? Whether it's the random mutation, the replication mutation, and so on, that explains how we have this diversity and a testimonial to the greatness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So it's the simplicity of this approach that is to me a stronger testimonial to the presence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and to the wonderful law.
Sure. And all right, makes sense. I remember, yeah, simplicity being one of the criteria to establish scientific theory, at least in the last century. Never mind. So in one of your article, you also mentioned that within the field of evolution, we might call for an Einsteinian theory of evolution. What do you mean by Einsteinian theory of evolution?
Yeah. So that term was coined or said by my father, who passed away 6 years ago. He was a scientist and a physician. And we had many, many evenings discussing evolution. And again, my thought evolved, not in an evolutionary way, but it changed with time with those conversations with him. And that's why dialogue is so important, right? Because with somebody you feel you are within a safe space where you can say crazy ideas and nobody's going to judge you. And I think that's very important. So when I was writing that article, I was sharing it with him. We were talking about the different ways. So he said, people keep saying that there are some leaps in evolution, macroevolution, microevolution. And there are certain things that you think, evolution does not explain them 100% now, which is fine. That's part of the joy, the journey, the spice of life, right? You're not going to get everything right. You think you are, but then when you answer one question, you get 100 other questions. And that means you're on the right track. So his idea was that for those things we cannot explain, we should never go back to just looking at the Quran, trying to find it in the Quran. No, it's about looking forward among humans who has a new way of thinking, like Einstein. Because remember, he came and he showed that Newton physics worked within only a certain limit, but then his idea of relativity was able to explain the other phenomena that nobody was able to explain. And so he was thinking, for those, maybe somebody would come with an Einsteinian way of thinking outside the box, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would have given him a hiba, it's being intelligent, your neurons are connected in a different way, you see the world in a different way. And so you may come up with a further explanation. So I'm not saying we're going to throw away the evolutionary theory. We're saying we build on it, we expand it. And that's why we don't want to say the Quran is the law, because that natural law could expand and change with time, with tools, with technology, with new humans coming in and being born into future generations.
Can I ask a question or two?
Oh, yeah, please.
Go ahead.
Yeah, good. Thanks for that. So I think many Muslims would agree with the general thing, what the message you're talking about, dialogue, exploration, seeing the world as a creation. But in the people that we've been interviewing or that we have read from, I think they have a particular issue with not maybe general things like laws of nature, but that, there are these different verses of the Quran and the Hadith which appear to be pointing very strongly in a certain direction about the origin of Adam. So it's not, I think this is where the conversation, we've spoken to people and we speak to people who are coming from completely different ends of the spectrum. And I'm wondering where you see, so there are some things in the Quran, like, for example, it talks about the world being created in a certain number of days. And even ayam in Arabic, even in the past, the scholars would have interpreted them in different ways because of, different reasons. But when it comes to Adam alayhi salam, as in there are multiple ayat of the Quran, hadith, and to the extent that there appears to be even, that was just the common view of all the Muslims throughout, and actually the Jews and the Christians, I guess, as well. So I suppose the issue here is basically, so when do you interpret metaphorically? And I guess the question would be, or the issue that people would argue from the other side, is that if there is so much evidence in terms of the ayat and the hadith, then it becomes difficult to interpret somehow. So how do you see that?
Okay, so thank you for the question. And again, I first respond by saying we do not look in the Quran for scientific evidence, because that is not the purpose of the Quran. So that by itself should, reset the whole framing of what we do with those verses, right? So then that means we see these verses, we read them, we interpret them in a whole different framework. And I think that's where I want to go, and I invite others to go there. So if you're reading a verse about Adam, what does that mean in terms of how I live my life? And instead of being, is a literal saying how Adam was formed. And if I say the Quran is not about scientific evidence and scientific laws, then you don't have to even, that question never pops up to start with. right? So
Right.
so that's how I would respond. Now, adding over, so that to me is the first level, and that's how I go about it. Because otherwise, again, you're one would be contradicting themselves. Because if I start explaining every verse to fit evolution, I would be doing the thing that I'm saying I shouldn't do, right? Because if I interpret it today, in 100 years, my interpretation will be wrong, right? But having said that, we can go in to try to address the people's concerns and to show them how it doesn't fit. Even when they try to interpret, it doesn't fit. Again, I don't do that usually, but just to prove the point. First of all, let's take hadith out of the way and let's focus only on the Quran. Because when you talk about hadith, I mean, I'm not a hadith expert, but I can guarantee to my knowledge, but I'm open to anybody to discuss this, that most of the hadith who talk about creation are not necessarily, you have the sanad and the matan. They have a problem with one or the other, okay? And so let's stick to the Quran, because the hadith is supposed to interpret the Quran. So just because there are many hadiths that talk about Adam and Eve, which are really Israeliyat and has nothing to do with interpretation of the Quran or Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And I think that's important to make clear, because people use those to claim, and it's a futile conversation if we say the hadith is not, authentic.
Right.
So now we go to the Quran. In the Quran, again, those who have these are verses, these are words interpreted by humans. So who is that human who is interpreting those verses to prove like a natural phenomena, right? Not to use it for everyday life. Is do they have enough scientific background to interpret? And this is part of Islam, that you should know, you should be an expert. You should have the knowledge, the experience, the scholarship before you attempt to do anything. So those scholars who interpret the Quran to explain a natural phenomena, I question their scientific background and expertise in biology. Okay? So that's number one. How much do they really understand evolution? Because many of them will say, oh yeah, I'm a physician. Excuse me, I respect all physicians. They are not evolutionary biologists. Or they say, oh, I did my bachelor's in biology. Again, with all due respect, if you don't understand the fundamentals of biology and cells and molecules, you cannot come and claim to talk about interpretation of verses. So that's also number two. Now, but at the same time, of course, I respect that the biologist is not also an expert in language or tafsir to also claim that they can interpret it all. That's why for any interpretation, it should be a groups of people with different expertise to sit together to come to a consensus of what that verse or group of verses could mean. And it shouldn't be one alone who is not an expert on everything. So that's why I should have language experts, semantics, linguistics, history, of course, scholarly in theology, biology, etc., etc. Now, when we come to those verses that appear to contradict, what you just mentioned is that most people will agree, but their problem is with Adam. So for the first stage, agreeing in general about the phenomena of evolution, I set counter with a question. Why do, talk about Muslims, why do Muslims have no problem and do not consider it, leaving Islam or kufr, when the verses that talk about the creation of the universe, the sun, the planets, the moon, nobody has a problem with that, that there are laws that Allah put, and that Allah created the universe and then let the laws unfold. Usually there's no problem around that. The problem only comes when we're talking about life, right? So to me, it's like, wait, in both verses, Allah says khalaq. So how come when we talk about khalaq life, suddenly there's a lot of problems, but when we talk about khalaq al-shams wal-nujum, it's okay, right? So it's all the same khalq, right? So that to me is one counter argument about the khalq. Then and then one thing I forgot to mention is a lot of the interpretations you just said are similar of the book, let's say the holy book, whether it's Bible, Torah, or Quran. You say all these religions disagree with evolution in the same way. And to me, that's a red flag, right? Because we know that there are changes in the Bible and the Torah. I'm taking as a Muslim, right? So then obviously why would I use them as proof if I'm already saying that there are some things that we disagree on to start with fundamentally? So again, that's just a note on the side. going back to the Quran. So people don't have a problem with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala putting the laws for gravity, let's say, and then the universe taking billions of years to come to be. And they don't discuss that, no, Allah is intervening at every minute. But when I talk about life taking millions and even a billion, when we talk from the beginning, according to evolutionary law, just like gravity law, why is there a problem? Now, the issue of time is always brought up, but that's brought up by Christians and Jews because of their book. In our book, there's no limit on time. I mean, how you interpret a day, also in the Quran it says, so the time is a fluid concept that is not restricting us as Muslims to use it. So, oh my God, look, again, these are all literary translations and not why the role to me of what the Quran is. I keep reminding you. So time is not a problem. Time is not a problem. Let life take a billion years, let the universe take a billion years. And I just point out the contradiction in why one is allowed and one is not. Now, but the biggest challenge that I hear from Muslims is Adam. So they'll agree with everything else, but then Adam is, oh, no, that doesn't work, right? Well, first of all, a law is a law. Laws don't, gravity doesn't work sometimes and doesn't work other times. We know that. And that is part of the greatness of Allah. And why we believe in him, because we see how he has created these simple laws, and through these simple laws, the whole universe has unfolded. That is a testimonial to his azamah, to his greatness, and those laws are laws. So if the way life has evolved from simple beginnings to the different diversity we see today, then we shouldn't put exceptions to a particular organism, which happens to be us, by the way. So to me, this points and smells of arrogance. Of humans, saying we are different. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in many instances reminds us and warns us of not being arrogant. That our role as humans is to be in harmony with nature, not that we are dominate or we are better. So this concept of hierarchy and being better is it is not Islamic. It is not innate in our fitrah. And it comes from a Judeo-Christian approach and framing and understanding of the world. And unfortunately, we have adopted it without realizing and internalized it as being Islam. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has warned us of this in the verses that actually describe the creation of Adam. Because when he asks Shaitan to bow to Adam, what does Adam say? He says, I am better than him. So his problem, or the biggest sin, was hierarchy. Something is better than something. That is the biggest sin. We see it today in Gaza, right? We see it, how Zionism treats, some are human and some are not so human. We see it, this thread of imperialism and supremacy. In this context today, it's white supremacy. For the shaitan, it was his supremacy. We see it in colonialism. Our civilization, anything else is not. Our education, anything else is not. And so that's the biggest sin. And so for us to say Adam is different, that is also continuing thread of hierarchy, which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala warned us from the story of Adam and the shaitan and the bowing. And up till now, when he says, he keeps warning us of not to be arrogant. And he reminds us what is our role in the world. And that fits so beautifully with the theory of evolution, that the origin of life, and then you have all the branches of the tree. There is not one organism that is better or worse than another one. Each one has evolved to be the most fit for the circumstances in which it exists. That is not better or worse, because in the next generation, if the circumstances change, those traits that made you survive may be actually detrimental. So this binary of better or worse is also a very Judeo-Christian approach and framing of looking at the world. In Islam, we celebrate diversity. In Islam, you celebrate every creature, every organism with their diverse DNA, that they have a role to play in the world, the role to play in life. And so there's not better or worse. We just may not understand what is their role.
There's actually a very nice book by Sarah Tilili, if that's how I say it. It's called Animals in the Quran. Animals in the Quran, and she actually discusses this idea about how within Islam, the role of animals and that humans are not automatically better somehow. It's a very nice book, actually, if you're interested. It goes through tafsirs about the animals in the Quran. Sarah Tilili, I advise that. It's a nice book. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That's amazing. So I don't know. So that's, I can maybe add one thing, which is, and therefore in the Quran, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, الذي أحسن كل شيء خلقه, the word ahsan, and that's the beauty of the Arabic language, right? You can interpret it in many ways to fit what you want. But in the way the people use it for evolution, they know ahsan meaning better. But we know ahsan can also mean the most fit. The ahsan to fit their environment, their circumstances. And so the bacteria is the ahsan, the best fit to live in the thermal bacteria in the hot springs of 80 degrees. I will never be the ahsan fit for that as a Homo sapiens. And similarly, so every creature, every organism evolved to be the most fit, ahsan, for its circumstances. And so that's how I look. And again, that's back to my approach, which I said, we see the science, we use the science because Allah said, use your mind, use the scientific method. And then if we look at the verses and somebody says, oh, there's a contradiction, we go back to the interpretation of that verse in the light of the scientific discoveries we have and in the light of what is the role of the Quran. So when I read الذي أحسن كل شيء خلقه, I'm reading it meaning the most fit, the most adapted. There's no hierarchy. It's all about all the creatures, and it's about how I learned from that to respect everything, to take care of everything, and that there's no hierarchy.
Thank you.
So maybe following up on that, it's like when you read the Quran, you read verses like Adam has been created from clay, or Adam has been created, or humans have been created from a single nafs. So not asking you to interpret the verse, but what do you think that the purpose of this verse, of Allah telling us that, is? Like, what's the moral we can derive from it?
I think Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, who's all-knowing, knows that we will always try to be arrogant. So he is reminding us that the beginnings of all organisms is the same. All of us are the same. So when he says from clay, he's saying not clay literally, he made a clay formation of statue and breathed air. Clay meaning from elements, mental elements that all creatures were made of, to remind us to be not arrogant. And again, reminding us of the original sin, which is hierarchy, and somebody or something is better than another.
But then you can still argue that the jinns and the humans have taken the amana, that they have taken the responsibility that anything else refused. So it still makes us special in a way.
It's how you look at it. It's how you frame it. Not necessarily. Not necessarily. It is making you more fit to do something, not making you better or worse. It's a framework. It's a framework of a lens of how we look at the world. And I think in today's world, we have been tainted by Western philosophy to such an extent, we stopped being able even to see the world without thinking of hierarchies. We need to really cleanse ourselves because we use it in everyday life, and we need to hark back to a time when, and we can find traces of it, by the way, not just in the Muslim civilization in the past. If you go to indigenous groups who are more bil fitra, you see that lack of something is better or something is, and so on. So it's a whole different way of thinking of the world, which I think we are very much in need of today.
And then if I can jump to another question, where you argue in another paper to reframe evolution, not to see competition between species, but to see collaboration or cooperation. If you can explain a bit more.
Oh, yes. So again, competition is a very Judeo-Christian Western, I think, concept. And we see it. We see it in something is better than the other. That stems from competition. We even see it how people interpret Darwin's theory of evolution, that it's the survival of the fittest, meaning there is one that is better than the other. Again, it is a misinterpretation. And it was used, right? Social Darwinism as an excuse for colonization. The white are better than others, and so on, slavery, etc. So it was used. And again, back to why we need guidance and ethics and values of how to use the scientific discoveries and not misuse them. And so to me, what is innate in us as humans in terms of our nature, which is why we survive. So that's the Islamic way of saying it. But as an evolutionary biologist, this is how we survived as a species. We survived as a species not because we're smarter. By the way, there are organisms that are equally smart. We survived because we are social creatures. We take care of each other. We cannot survive as an individual. And it is this community, social relationships that allowed us to survive. And we see it, and it's about collaborating in that community. We are diverse. We're not all the same. So every member of that community brings in something unique to make this community survive. You may not understand why there's this particular trait in this particular group or person, and you may not know because it is for later when the circumstances change. And so you celebrate everybody in your community and acknowledge the importance of their existence. And for example, people with mental health disorders, right? Schizophrenia. You would say, why was it that through evolution weeded out? It did it because there's some advantage to it that we don't understand for survival. So everything counts. Now, I'm speaking biology, but you can see that reflected in Islam. For example, in Islam, they built the first mental health hospitals because there's respect for human beings, regardless of who they are and what they are and what they have. Because since Allah made it or it happened, then there is an advantage. There is a hikmah we may not understand. So this is very different from competition. These are the weak people. We need to weed them out, get rid of them. In Islam, you celebrate everybody. You bring them all together. You may not understand why, but ultimately there will be a reason for their existence since Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala existed them. And we see, like I said, the manifestation of that in how we do health in the past. Now we're just following the Western concepts. We forgot that we have our own set of values that is more merciful. It is in the concept of how we take care of, even when you are in a war, who do you kill, who you do not kill, who do you take care of and who you do not, and many, many examples, right? So to me, and I see this collaboration, this concept, which is rooted in our biology and reflected in Islam, and it is for the survival of the species, for the survival of Earth, for the survival of nature and all other organisms, because we know that we are all in harmony with each other. If you tip, something happens wrong, the other parts will all be affected. So again, it is about using an old, new framework of how to look at the world, how to interpret the natural phenomena, and how to interpret our social behavior that is not anthropocenic and not part of the Western philosophy that has taken control of how we perceive the world and social relations and nature for that matter in the past 400 years. I mean, one example, in science of the past 300, 400 years, we have been using categorization and binaries to explain phenomena. Now, that may have helped to a certain extent to understand things, but now we see it is very limiting. And now we know that every trait is a continuum. And the only way to understand nature is by understanding it as a continuum. And again, how do you maintain that? It's through diversity. And in Islam, the core is about لولا يعني الاختلاف أمتي رحمة لولا and you have all this diversity built into the philosophy of Islam that, of course, since it is from Allah, it draws from nature, which is Allah's creation. And maybe, I don't know how much time we have left, I can draw and give an example.
As much as you want.
An example about explaining this and how when you change the framework of explaining phenomena, how the whole our relationships as humans changes. And then it becomes, which one should I use? Well, the closer one to nature that has biological evidence to go with it, because that is the evidence. It is Allah, the nature, what we see around us. So up till now, when people interpret or try to explain how people deal with trauma of violence, trauma of war, the framing is always that those who were exposed to war will pass on to their future generations the impact of that war, the signature of the trauma, and that the descendants will all be victims, vulnerable. They will have more diseases, cardiovascular, diabetes, cancer, whatever, mental health disorders, etc. That's what you see in the literature, all scientifically backed. Fine. But this is where every generation comes with a different way of thinking of the world. And that's why we need diversity, not just the Western people looking at science, but people from our part of the world looking at science. So we just published a paper last year for the first time in humans showing that indeed humans who were exposed to violence when pregnant, females, they pass on to their grandchildren an epigenetic signature of trauma, meaning their genes are not changed, but they are turned on or off. If we were to use the framework in what I just said, you would expect these were 14 genes, 14 sites. You would expect that they should be involved in all these disease pathways, biological pathways. Surprisingly, they were not in any known biological pathway and any known to deal with disease. You name it, they weren't there. So that made me pause and think, then something's wrong with that framework. Something's wrong with that explanation. Maybe if we look at it from the framework of not victimhood and vulnerability, especially if we remember that humans have been around for at least 200,000 years in the Homo sapiens kind of version, And they've been having wars. This is not the first time in the past 200 years. So we should all be victims and vulnerable, not knowing what to do. Why all of a sudden people are labeled as victims and vulnerable? And they happen to be all from the global south, by the way, the victims of colonialism and wars and all that. And so it's like, wait a minute. Nature, biology is telling us that we're not victims and vulnerable because we can't find any gene related to that victimhood and vulnerability that people are claiming. And of course, you can explain why they couldn't find them, because people were only looking for the negative. Nobody went and tallied the healthy people. They were only looking for the unhealthy people. And so we came up with a new framework saying that what the grandparents pass on to their grandchildren is not victimhood and vulnerability, but adaptation and agency. And other than the evidence that we've been around for 200,000 years and we're all okay, I mean, relatively speaking. But the other thing is, you see the same phenomena in octopus. So again, you look to nature. Allah said, look, reflect. In octopus, they're very similar to humans in the sense they're very smart, but also they're very social. So you can draw parallels. And they live in complex environments. And they have what they pass on to future generations as a result of exposure to complex environments. They have a lot of regulation of gene expression. But nobody talks about the octopus being a victim because it's an octopus. It doesn't have the human component. You can be neutral and talk about it in an objective way. But for humans, no, the Western scientists are going to explain it in a way that suits their framework of the world, that somebody is better than something dominates something else. Hence, for humans, we're victims and vulnerable. So trying to put the record straight and trying to go back to nature, innate, that no, we are adaptable. What gets passed on down to us is adaptability to a future environment that we don't know what it's about. And to me, I can see that in Islam, in how we look at the world, right? That everybody, again, it's not about some are victims and this binary. That no, everybody's important, and whatever gets passed down and is alive, that means has a purpose. So with that, I'll end there. Unless you have, other questions for that question. Sorry, yeah.
Kamal, go ahead. Otherwise, I have a few more.
Yeah. So actually, you mentioned just today about the mujtahid, the person striving to make some kind of legal or theological conclusion. There's a hadith, I think you mentioned, that they get 2 rewards, one for the effort and one for being correct. So I think this is actually a really interesting, important part of the discussion, because I feel like people trained, or, people who are sort of, let's say, anti-evolution in some sense, they often come from, or have been trained in a kind of traditional setting where there are scholars and consensus. So basically, that there is quite a strong hierarchy in, there's the mujtahid imams, there's the, Imam Abu Hanifa, Imam Shafi, and there's the Imam Ashari, etc., and the Maturidi. So there is a strong distinction between who is qualified to give, new and different rulings, and those who are less qualified because they're not as educated or prepared. On the other hand, there are other people in the world who feel like, everyone has a brain, everyone can read, everyone can understand. And so there should be more diversity in who is allowed to and who isn't, or who is qualified and who isn't. I feel like this is quite important sort of point in this conversation somehow, because it seems to kind of be it's like some people say, I shouldn't be giving the opinions, I'll refer to scholars, and they have a certain view. Other people say that we should all have our own view and everyone can be involved. Could you comment on that maybe a bit more?
I think as humans, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala asks us to use our brain. We have a responsibility to use our minds and brains and to question things. That's innate, and we are obliged to do that. So that's where I start. Now, as we question, and that's why if we have a curiosity and something we read, you have a curiosity, you go read, you explore, you ask people. If you're happy with what they told you and it satisfies your curiosity, that's fine. That's fine. You're happy. That's it. Nobody's going to tell you not to. If you're not, if you feel uncomfortable, if you feel it doesn't make sense, Allah tells you need to keep questioning and exploring. So it becomes your responsibility, and it becomes that tension. How much are you uncomfortable? Therefore, how much are you going to put an effort to explore more? That's when Allah puts guidelines, right? That you need to have the qualifications. You need to have the expertise. You need to do your homework. You need to get your hands dirty like Ibrahim. You can't just sit back on a couch and say, I don't like this. Well, if you really don't like it, you need to go do something about it. You can't just talk. And we know in Quran, there's other verses that says, you can't just, I can't remember what the verses are, but you can't just complain and talk without actually going and doing something about it. And so for those who are not comfortable, they can't just stop at the point of uncomfortable and talking. They need to, as if they were a good Muslim, they need to go do their homework and get their hands dirty. Now, once they do that, then it's a dialogue, right? I tell a lot of my students, or tell me, no, you're wrong. Evolution is wrong. The X person said the interpretation of the verse is like that. I said, listen, it's fine. But first of all, before you come and discuss something with me, did you do your homework? Did you understand all the biology before you come and talk to me? Right? That's number one. And then number two, I say, and it's okay. I may be wrong, and that's okay. And the scholar of interpretation can be wrong. That's okay. The idea is keep discovering and exploring, and you may come up with a third theory, the Einsteinian thing, and that's great. We will all learn. But we can't just say, you're wrong, I'm right, he's wrong, and he's right, without actually rolling our sleeves up and actually doing something. And to me, that's what Islam is about. And maybe we'll come up with a whole new theory. Wow. But you can't tell me a whole new theory based on a scholar of religion who is interpreting, saying that this verse doesn't fit the natural phenomena when he has not worked in the natural phenomena as an expert, because that's not being a good Muslim. If you see the argument. So I don't deny having another answer, but you have to work the right way to get another answer.
Right. Thank you. Yeah.
This idea further, what if two people are comfortable in opposing views with opposing interpretation of the same verse? Then that's it.
So, tilaf ummati rahma, right? It's okay. We have diverse opinions. And I tell my students and people who don't want to agree with evolution, I say, really, it doesn't matter. Why? Because in a daily life, it doesn't matter. Because you're living your life and I'm living my life, it's not going to affect us. And by the way, just to tell you, you are using the vaccine that was developed as a result of evolutionary theory. You are eating tomatoes that are nice and bright and red, or strawberries, or watermelon that doesn't have a seed. All that is based on evolutionary theory. So even if you disagree, you are actually enjoying and benefiting from the results of science of the theory of evolution in your everyday life. So for you it's a philosophical thing you want to entertain. That's fine, so long as it doesn't result in harm of people. For example, if you disagree with the theory of evolution and therefore you say, okay, if vaccines were made because of theory of evolution, then I will not take the vaccine and I will not give it to my children. Okay, then that's when there may become a harm because of your opinion. And it's okay for yourself. You don't want to take a vaccine? Don't take it. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala judges you for yourself. But if you start imposing your opinion on others, that's when Islam, back to Islam, says that's not allowed. You cannot impose. Nobody should impose or judge others. That's when it becomes al-maslaha al-'amma, right? And you don't allow that to happen. You cannot interfere with the person, what they want to do with themselves. That's their freedom, their hurriya, their freedom for themselves. But if there's harm to others, then that's when somebody should say something. So that would be my response.
So you mentioned something interesting. You said to believe in the creation of Adam, like a direct divine action, a creation, or evolution, it doesn't matter. So then how do you separate what matters and what doesn't? And the question is because some people take the creation of Adam, like miraculous creation of Adam, as part of faith itself. How do you differentiate between what matters and what doesn't?
I think I don't understand your question. So what matters, you mean in what verse matter? All verses matter.
Yes.
It's how you interpret them. I'm not belittling. All verses are important, are from Allah and matter. The issue is the interpretation of the verse. That I'm not going to fight or have a disagreement if you interpret the verse about Adam different from me. That's what I meant. It's not going to affect our everyday life unless it starts harming another human being.
Maybe to
right?
explain,
We know that.
What he's asking. To throw another example, imagine if there was a Muslim in your classroom and they said, I don't believe in hell. I don't believe in hell. And you say, that's fine, it's your opinion. Or I think that's what he's asking. So Adam alayhi salam, creation of Adam alayhi salam, it seems like maybe you were saying that it's an opinion. So somebody's ijtihad, someone else's ijtihad. If somebody said, I don't believe in the Quran, or I don't believe in hell, or I don't believe in the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, would you say it's okay, it's just part of your opinion, my opinion? I think that's what
It
you're getting at,
depends.
maybe, Adrian. Yeah. So where do
Yeah.
you like where? How do you
So
how do you
maybe
choose
if I
which
can,
ones are?
I wouldn't go that far, but if I may
You're
give
not a
a,
Muslim anymore if you don't believe in the Quran. What's the point of the whole
well,
discussion?
but it's like I would agree that to the way Adam came into being does not matter, because one day I'll die and I'll be asked about who Allah is, who the Prophet is, about my prayers and so on, and not so much about how Adam came into being. That's how I understand when you say it doesn't matter. But then I would like to hear from you then, how do you differentiate what matters and what doesn't within religion when you read the Quran?
Yeah, but just want to add a thing to your point. I think also it is your intention, right? What is your intention from accepting or not, denying something or not? And Allah only knows your intention. Are you doing this because you don't believe and you're trying to find arguments? Or are you doing it sincerely because you do believe in Allah and you're trying to understand what it means? And nobody can judge that from the outside except Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that's why we need to respect everybody. So even if a student says something like, I don't believe in that, I mean, as long in Islam, you don't go judge anyone, because only Allah is the judge, unless they harm someone else. That's when you interfere, and harming, that's the social component. And then back to the role of Islam in society. You can do whatever you want in your mind. It's between you and Allah. In your house, you can close the door and nobody has anything to do with what's happening in your house. Again, back to the concept of Islam and social and community. And so whatever you, in your mind and your brain, you want to entertain, that's fine. Right? So, but to your point, for me, what matters and what doesn't matter, I think to me, as I read the Quran, because that's your question, if I happen on a verse, either I have inherited an explanation of that verse, like most of us from the Mufassirin, what we were, we grew up on. And as we grow older and more experienced, sometimes we question that interpretation. Like, wait a minute, that's different. That doesn't make sense to me. And to me, what makes me decide what makes sense and what doesn't is how much I feel uncomfortable. We have so many things in our lives and we're doing so many things. How much is my curiosity piqued? How much time I have to go search will make me decide which verse I'm just going to say, you know what? I'm fine. I don't have the time to go after this. I'm okay. Between, oh my God, I can't sleep. I have to go figure this out. And then I go and do the work. And I think that's different from person to person. And there will always be something we will, not have enough time for, and will come at a different time when we have time or we have changed and so on. So to me, that's what kind of drives me. I'll be okay. There's things not answered, but then I read the Quran again, or I hear somebody. There's a person you should know about. His name is Yusuf Abu Awad. He's I don't know if you've heard. He speaks in Arabic. He's a theological scholar. He's PhD is in linguistics, and he's using a linguistic approach to interpret the Quran, which is phenomenal. I mean, because the way he interprets the terms, it's all steeped in Arabic, of course. You have to know Arabic to understand what he's talking about. It's beautiful. And I think regardless if people agree to every interpretation of his or not, it is another diversity in how we look at the Quran and explain it. And to me, it is beautiful. And people argue, oh, why should somebody come now after 1,400 years with something new? Why not? We're all new. Every human being is different. Every human being has a different DNA than anyone who has ever existed in the past, lives today, or will ever live in the future. Even identical twins are different because of epigenetics. And so why not for somebody to come and say, wait a minute, maybe we can interpret this verse in a different way, considering also the different circumstances in the life we live. And that is so beautiful, so inviting, so inspiring. And it makes you want to live, and it makes you want to explore. And that is innate in our fitrah. And that's what Allah tells us to keep doing.
Okay. And then I have another question on miracles. It's like, if you assume that Adam alayhi salam was created through a process of evolution, because it has to follow laws, and why would you suddenly halt the laws just for humans? You assume that everything follow specific laws. How do you explain other events that Allah talks about, like the staff of Musa turning into a snake, or the parting of the sea, or the splitting of the moon, and all this?
So the way I explain it, again, my personal opinion, I'm not imposing it on anybody, is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala put laws for the universe, right? The universe we know, and if there are other universes we don't know, there are laws Allah put. Now, within the universe that we live in, we exist, if we encounter a phenomena that appears not to follow a law we know, like then in my interpretation, it's not a breaking of a law. It is just following a law that we have not discovered yet as humans. We may never discover them because, again, we are limited in our biology. Our brains are limited, and we may in the future. But to me, they still follow the laws put by Allah. So I don't deny, Allah is responsible for that phenomena. We don't understand it, so we call it a miracle or a breaking of the law. But I say, no, it is following Allah's laws. We just haven't discovered the laws. And I'll give you an example. If you look at ants, from giving a concrete example, ants, their brain capacity is much simpler than humans. So they can only sense 2 dimensions, not 3 dimensions. I mean, physically, because time is the 4th dimension for us, right? But for ants, they know like right and left and in front and back. They don't know up and down. That's why like ant will keep on try and go up a wall and then keep falling because it can't comprehend that there's a 3rd dimension above it. So if you imagine we're all ants living in ant world and we go into our homes, which are circles, we close the door behind us. We think we're in a circle, 2 dimension. Nobody's there. It's only us. We close the door. And then suddenly a sphere from a 3rd dimension, it comes down. Now the ant it cannot even comprehend that dimension. The sphere comes into the circle from coming from above. To the ant inside the circle, something appeared out of nowhere, right? And then disappeared into nowhere. For the ant, there's no law to explain this. This is a breaking of a law. But we know that there's a 3rd dimension, and this is a very normal following physics law of a 3rd dimension. So similarly, we live in 4 dimensions, the 3, physical, and time. So anything that comes, and we know through mathematical calculations that the universe has 11 dimensions. And so there are things in other dimensions we can never comprehend. And so this is just an example of phenomena happening that seem to break a law when probably they are following a law that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala put. To me, that makes a lot more sense than Allah breaking laws right and left depending on what and where, right? It is a testimonial to the greatness of Allah. Now, to add to that is maybe another big issue people that kind of relates to this is time, right? So Allah, when does He, and it's an issue of evolution and creation. What if the laws unfold from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Then how does He interfere or doesn't He interfere? Which is kind of connected to the miracles thing. But if I say the miracles are not breaking of laws, they are Allah's laws, I similarly say that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is above time. He is not caught in time, right? Because when I first started, I said Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is above anything we will ever imagine. So He is above time. We are stuck in time. So we can simultaneously say that these laws are unfolding throughout time, throughout the physics of this universe that we live in. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is above time. I mean, in a way, because He's outside of time, He is interfering all the time, but He is not part of time. And I think that to comprehend that, once we comprehend that, then there's no contradiction. I think the contradiction only comes when we start assuming Allah experiences the world like we do. And we say, oh, he has to interfere in time. He has to break the time. He has to come in. He is beyond time. And it's difficult to comprehend what does that mean and probably we won't be able to. But once we do, then things are much simpler.
So that doesn't mean that, well, all the way at the beginning, when you say that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created at a certain moment the universe and its laws, we shouldn't assume that He just let it go by itself.
It depends on whose perspective. Our perspective or His perspective? From our perspective, yes. From His perspective, there's no time. So the whole thing doesn't mean anything to Him.
Sorry, that's it. Actually, no, I've got, it was a small miracle that I was about to ask about miracles and you asked about miracles. So that's a miracle. And thank you. That's my question. I'm thinking, yeah.
Then I do have a last one because of the previous speakers. His issue with modern science was the flattening of science to the materiality of this world and the dismissal of that vertical link with the supernatural, but with all the angels and others. And because of that, he would be more akin to dismiss evolution because that theory comes from a materialistic mindset.
So you want my comment on that?
Yes, like for you said something similar in the sense that the view we have today of evolution is from imperialist powers that have a certain framing of the theory, even of what they've seen, of the way they explored the world. So why would you take a theory from these people, from that ideology in the first place? Why not dismissing it and trying to figure out something maybe anew, or going back to pre-modern times or pre-modern understanding of the world?
Okay, first of all, back to the
I
Quran.
see you smiling.
Back to the Quran. The Quran says uses your brain. It doesn't say go back to something pre-modern or think of the supernatural. The Quran says uses your brain. Ibrahim and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he doesn't go do this 1, 2, 3. We have if we want to go back to pre-modern, they understood it in that way. You actually do have to be practical and do everyday things in the materialistic world, because that's where you live, and that's part of your everyday life. You don't, so you need to engage with the materialistic. The thing is how you engage, right? How you interpret it, using the Quran as a guideline, how to do it in the right way. Meaning I don't dominate nature. I try to understand it, to use it for good. I don't put myself in the center. I try to understand how everything is in harmony. So it's not this or the other. It's not this is wrong and that is right. It is about using our senses that were given to us, our minds that were given to us, that so many verses talk about, to understand, using our brain capacities within what we have, to make a better life. And that message is repeated multiple times in the Quran. So I'm surprised by somebody saying, I don't want to use the materialistic, I don't want to engage. When Allah is speaking of not just the Quran, Hadith Muhammad ﷺ, that you can't just sit and wait, you have to go work. You can't, in all his life, it was about being practical. It was about doing, the practical thing. It was about thinking, and then to tawakkal ala Rabbil Alameen. Not just sit back and say, you know what, I'm not going to do anything. And then any person who says that, you find in their everyday life, they're actually utilizing everything in their everyday life. That is very materialistic. And this separation of nature and when you say materialistic, we're talking nature from the spiritual, is very Christian, by the way. In Islam, everything is a harmony. You do not deny nature. Rasulullah, he was a human walking amongst us as a human. He married, he died. So this separation that, no, we want to be spiritual, we don't want to do anything materialistic, is a very Judo-Christian way of looking at the world. Islam celebrates your humanity as a materialistic human and helps you acknowledge, celebrate your humanity, your materialistic things that Allah made in you. So we have to evolve through evolution because of Allah's law. But then how do you use it in a good way? So Rasulullah, you get ajr, and the whole, how your life is built around it. In your life, if you eat, if you sleep, if you marry, if your intention is for doing good, then you get ajr for all of it. This is not materialistic. And on the contrary, if you prevent yourself from those things, you are not being a good Muslim. So in Islam, it is beautifully looking at the world, nature, in a very beautiful way that embraces everything that Allah created and not making a separation, which is not.
I'm hesitating to ask other questions, but maybe a last one just to bother you a bit. So in one of the texts, you write about you reading through the story of Adam, the acquisition of responsibility, like divine responsibility. So how would you read the story of Eve, like the spouse?
Okay, that story has been taken out of context so much in modernity. For me, Allah subhanahu, again, back, the Quran is not a book of science. So it's not about where did Eve, by the way, come from, which part, okay? It's not about that, number one. Number two, in the Quran, there are no verses talking about physical creation of Eve. Any interpretation are by hadiths that are loaded with Israeliyat, all of them. And I can guarantee you can trace each one of them that these are not authentic hadiths at all. So back to then, what is the purpose of the story? The purpose of the story, first of all, is that Adam is representation of humanity, right? And what is the social role of humans in this? Because the Quran came to us, it didn't come to other animals, right? It came to us as humans, so it speaks to us. What is our role? And because as organisms, we evolved as other organisms. It's through sexual reproduction to get the diversity. There is a male and a female. And because of the different roles of males and females within the biological nature of things, that many things are similar, but there are differences. A woman has a uterus, a woman nurses. So those slight differences assume different roles for a woman. Now, because humans will, again, back to the big sin, right? On sin, hierarchy. Something is better than something. The concept that a male, because he's different physically from a female, that there will be this assumption that I am better than her. And we see it because in Christianity, the story of Adam has been mangled in a sense that Adam is the pure guy and poor Eve is the one who tempted him. And so she's the source of all evil. And that story. In the Quran, that story does not exist. And so the role of both Adam and Eve is to take that responsibility. There shouldn't be any hierarchy, and that they both complement each other, which is how nature is. You cannot have survival if you don't have both sexes of the species for it to move forward. So that would be my answer. And by the way, I mean, every time I read the Quran or listen to somebody new, it comes makes me want to think like, what could that mean? And there are many new ways of looking at it that does not impact the theory of evolution because that's biology, but to try to help people understand what is the purpose of those verses for us as humans to live our lives.
جزاك الله خيرا. Yes.
Jamal.
Kamal, again, if you have a question, otherwise I'll wrap it up.
That's, I think we've talked about lots of different things. Alhamdulillah, very interesting. So yeah, it's okay. Yeah, I'm okay. Thank you.
Again, thank you, Rana, for joining, for accepting.
No, I love it. Thank you. Shukran. Jazakumullahu khairan. And inshallah, it will benefit the listeners. And I invite anybody to contact me, send me questions, comments, critiques, because I truly, truly want to know more. And I truly, truly am curious. And inshallah, with that, we will try to be good Muslims who follow what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala asked us to do with our capacities, inshallah, to make this world a better place for all humanity. Inshallah. يجمعنا في الآخرة.
آمين. جزاك الله خيرا. سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون والسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين. وإياك.
الحمد لله.